At the age of 25, I found myself unexpectedly targeted by my pastor, a man significantly older than me, older even than my own father. This individual was entrusted with the role of my spiritual guide, a figure who was supposed to provide support, wisdom, and encouragement in my journey of faith. However, to my shock, he chose to misuse the personal information I had shared during a private therapy session, weaponizing my vulnerabilities against me. To understand the complexity of my situation, it is essential to provide some background. I married my husband when I was just 17 years old, while he was 21. Our union, born from youthful passion, faced fierce opposition from my parents. They believed that I was far too young to enter into such a significant commitment and argued that I had not yet completed my education. Having set up a college fund for me when I was 5 years old, they envisioned a different future for me, one that included attending college and pursuing academic achievements. However, fueled by teenage rebellion and a desire for independence, I felt convinced that I knew better. In a moment of defiance that was typical of many adolescents, I ran away from home to marry my husband, who at the time was part of a boy band. He painted a picture of a bright future, suggesting that he was on the cusp of stardom, with dreams of becoming a rock star. The allure of having thousands of fans clamoring for attention captivated my youthful imagination. Just 2 months after eloping, life took a dramatic turn when I learned I was pregnant. Still barely a teenager myself, I was about to embark on the journey of motherhood while accompanying a group of aspiring musicians. The glamorous vision I held of rock stardom quickly began to evaporate as I faced the harsh realities of our situation. I soon realized that my husband's band was not as talented as I had initially believed. In fact, they struggled significantly in their endeavors. Their earnings from concerts were meager and required splitting with other bands sharing the tour. Drawing large crowds was a fantasy, and ultimately, the band disbanded. The dream of a musical career gave way to the necessity of financial survival, and we faced the daunting challenges of adulthood far too quickly. As we transitioned into parenthood, the pressure mounted. We experienced serious financial difficulties, even resorting to panhandling and hitchhiking to make ends meet. It became increasingly clear that my husband needed to seek stable employment, as our transient lifestyle was unsustainable for our growing family. Despite the fact that my parents would have likely offered assistance, especially for the sake of their grandchildren, my pride and stubbornness led me to reject their help. My relationship with them had been strained at best, compounded by their strict and conservative beliefs. They were devout Pentecostals, who held traditional views regarding premarital relationships and religious practices, including speaking in tongues. I was raised in an environment where church attendance and regular prayers were non-negotiable elements of life. The rigid constraints of my upbringing often left me envious of peers who experienced more freedom in their homes. Meeting my husband represented an opportunity for me to break free from my oppressive upbringing. However, this desire for independence came with its own set of challenges. I was determined to carve my path, rejecting the notion of returning to my parents as a disappointment or a failure. The idea of being seen as the prodigal daughter loomed large in my mind, and I was resolute in my belief that I could prove my worth independent of their influence. In stark contrast to my sheltered existence, my husband had a very different background. He grew up in a halfway home, with no knowledge of his biological parents. His life experiences cultivated a strong sense of determination and passion, which I found inspiring in those early days. During his adolescence, he had formed a band with neighborhood friends, partly to stay out of trouble but also to find a sense of belonging and purpose. At the time, I admired his ambition and saw in him a cool factor that drew attention from others, including myself. Yet, as we faced the reality of our lives, it became increasingly evident that the musical aspirations we once held could not sustain us. Recognizing that continued touring was not yielding the financial stability we desperately needed, we made the difficult decision to settle down in one place. My husband cycled through a series of temporary jobs while I focused on caring for our children, navigating the complexities of young parenthood and the pursuit of stability in our unconventional life. He had fortunately completed high school, a milestone that allowed him to secure minimum wage jobs with relative ease. This stood in stark contrast to my own situation, as I had not finished my high school education. In fact, I was in the final stretch of my studies, mere months away from graduation, when I made the impulsive decision to run away with my husband. This choice left me without any marketable skills, a reality that would weigh heavily on my conscience in the coming years. I often found myself regretting not completing my high school education or even pursuing a college degree, particularly since I had been an excellent student throughout my time in school. However, my rebellious nature took precedence, driving me to feel that I was missing out on life, craving adventure and yearning to explore the world beyond the confines of my small-town existence. As time went on, the validity of my parents' advice became increasingly clear. My two younger siblings, who had chosen to stay home, returned to the fold and were thriving in their own lives. I maintained contact with them during this tumultuous period, but my own circumstances grew increasingly dire. I gave birth to 3 children, and the challenges of motherhood compounded our struggles. We could barely afford a roof over our heads, leading us to move frequently from one motel to another, and at times, we faced the grim reality of sleeping under bridges when our funds ran dry. Our environment was fraught with the presence of numerous homeless individuals and people grappling with mental health issues and substance abuse. Unfortunately, my husband became involved in drug use as well, creating a further strain on our relationship. The constant fighting and arguments between us revolved predominantly around money. I found myself in desperate need for my husband to step up and earn more so that we could secure stable housing and escape the relentless cycle of misery we were trapped in. It was unbearable to witness my children suffer from hunger or lack basic necessities. Our hardship reached such an extreme that I even contemplated engaging in sex work, but my husband was adamantly opposed to the idea. Nevertheless, the sight of my children enduring hardships pushed me to secretly resort to such measures behind his back. It was only after a horrifying incident that I decided to stop. A customer, refusing to pay, brandished a weapon and brutally attacked me, leaving me severely injured and robbed. The trauma from this encounter has haunted me ever since. Strangers found me in a pool of blood and rushed me to the hospital. Upon my discharge, I was too frightened to share the complete truth with my boyfriend at the time. I merely told him I had been robbed. In the aftermath, we had no choice but to rely on shelters and food pantries scattered throughout the town, which provided some much-needed relief. As our desperation intensified, we turned to a local Pentecostal church for assistance. Having grown up in a Pentecostal atmosphere, I was well aware of how to gain their trust and sympathy by saying and doing the right things. The church offered us a deal. In exchange for their support, we would participate in church activities, help with cleaning, and serve as ushers during services. While this was not a mandatory requirement, we viewed it as an opportunity to rebuild our lives and strengthen our relationship with our faith. With the church's support, my husband pursued a 2-year programming degree, a decision that dramatically altered our trajectory. Upon graduating, he secured a position at a startup company, which led to an improvement in our financial situation. We became self-sufficient and were finally able to rent our own apartment. This represented the first time I had a stable place to call home, free from the constant need to move every week. It was a significant improvement for both my children and me, and our lives seemed to be on an upward trajectory. However, this newfound stability came at a cost. My husband dedicated long hours to his job, often spending up to 15 hours a day at the office, and he frequently brought work home. At the age of 23, as a mother of 3, my daily life revolved around attending church services, organizing church programs, and babysitting for fellow church members. This stark contrast to the life I had once envisioned for myself was hard to accept. I had dreamed of marrying a rock star, traveling the world, having children in my 30s, and ultimately settling down. Instead, I found myself with a husband who had transformed from the long-haired, rebellious bad boy into a clean-cut computer professional, bringing to life the realization that the paths we take can lead us far away from our original dreams. As time passed, our affection for one another began to diminish. My husband devoted an overwhelming amount of his time and energy to his job, which meant that most of our conversations revolved around his work-related issues, ongoing projects, and his ambitious plans to increase his income. I was genuinely pleased to see his success, recognizing that he had discovered something he truly excelled at, earning him recognition from his employer. He was making great strides in his career, rapidly advancing up the salary ladder to achieve a 6-figure income. Our life narrative became one of resilience and determination, encapsulating our journey from humble beginnings to a significantly better financial situation. This progress allowed me the opportunity to prove my parents wrong about our potential. I took immense pride in my husband's achievements and his determination to provide for our family. However, despite this external success, I felt a persistent sense of unfulfillment gnawing at me. Approximately 5 years later, my desire to find purpose and connection led me to become more actively involved in our church community. I started hosting services and occasionally teaching Bible studies, which allowed me to contribute to our family's income while also serving a greater purpose. Alongside this, I decided to open a daycare business to keep myself occupied, particularly because my husband's income had grown significantly. With this financial success came an increase in his work commitments, which often overshadowed our personal lives. He became completely absorbed in his professional responsibilities, leaving little time for our relationship. As a result, I began to feel increasingly isolated and alone. The dynamic between us shifted, and our relationship began to resemble that of mere roommates. There were periods when we went without intimacy for weeks on end, leading me to initially suspect infidelity or the possibility of my husband leading a double life. However, I soon came to understand that this was not the case. Fast forward to my 26th birthday, my husband's income had improved, and our family was in a more stable financial position than we had ever been before. However, I found myself carrying the heavy burden of unresolved trauma from a previous assault, compounded by the struggles of postpartum depression. These challenges left me feeling constantly unhappy and isolated. In an attempt to cope with these feelings, I directed my focus on our children, but this decision did not alleviate the deterioration of my mental health, which tragically led to weight gain and further emotional distress. Concerned for our family's well-being, we made the decision to move to a better neighborhood on the other side of town, believing that a change of environment could foster a renewed sense of hope. We also joined a new church, which offered me the chance to engage in community activities. However, while I immersed myself in church life, my husband remained less involved, choosing to attend services only every other Sunday. We both recognized that our marriage was struggling, prompting us to take proactive measures to address these issues. Knowing that our church provided marriage counseling, I suggested that we attend sessions together. Initially, my husband believed that our marriage did not require such intervention, but he agreed to the idea after seeing how much it meant to me. Our senior pastor, known for his wisdom and profound understanding of Scripture, was assigned to conduct our counseling sessions. He was a sought-after figure within our congregation, with many couples seeking his guidance. During our first session, which took place on a Monday evening, he focused on understanding the dynamics of our relationship. His ability to create a comfortable and welcoming atmosphere allowed us to open up about our feelings. Within the course of the 45-minute session, he effectively broke through our defenses and encouraged us to explore the underlying issues affecting our marriage. The pastor recommended that we dedicate more time to discussing our relationship and spending quality time together, free from the distractions of work and our children. He offered practical communication techniques to help strengthen our bond, emphasizing the importance of connecting beyond the daily grind. Additionally, he suggested that taking regular vacations could be beneficial for us, something I had previously proposed to my husband but had always been postponed due to his busy work schedule. Our next counseling session was scheduled for 2 weeks later. When we returned home, we enthusiastically implemented many of the strategies he had shared, and we began to see positive changes in our communication within a short period. However, we acknowledged that there was still considerable work to be done. 2 weeks later, during what was meant to be our follow-up session, my husband was preoccupied with an important product launch which made it impossible for him to attend. I called ahead to inform the church, and the pastor's personal assistant reached out to me afterward, suggesting that the pastor would like to see me for an individual counseling session, even without my husband present. I arrived at his office 20 minutes early, waiting in the lobby until it was my turn. When I finally entered his office, I apologized for my husband's absence, but he reassured me and invited me to take a seat on the couch. Our conversation centered on my relationship with my husband and the improvements we had managed to achieve thus far. It was a crucial moment in my journey, allowing me to reflect on the progress we had made and the challenges we still faced in our marriage. The conversation gradually moved toward the topic of personal interests, delving into my hobbies and the activities I found enjoyable during my leisure time. As we discussed these lighter topics, he offered several compliments that, while flattering, remained entirely appropriate, which I found comforting. This exchange led him to share his own life experiences and achievements, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a relaxed chat between friends rather than a formal counseling session. In the initial moments of our discussion, we touched briefly on my relationship, but as the conversation progressed, it seamlessly transitioned into a deeper exploration of our personal stories. We shared laughter and anecdotes, fostering a warmth that made me feel at ease in his presence. Despite not feeling a strong physical attraction to him, I sensed a level of comfort that allowed me to express myself candidly without any fear of judgment. For the first time since my traumatic assault, I felt liberated enough to reveal the intricate details of my experiences, which I had withheld from everyone, including my husband. This sense of liberation was invigorating. It was refreshing to interact with someone who seemed to possess a level of maturity and understanding that encouraged open dialogue. Our counseling session extended beyond the allocated time, a clear indication of the connection we were building through our conversation. However, a subtle reminder from his secretary indicating that the next couple was ready for their session interrupted our moment. In that moment, instead of scheduling a follow-up session with my husband, he proposed that I return for another individual counseling appointment. Without questioning the reasoning behind this shift from couples counseling, initially intended to enhance our relationship and facilitate better communication, I accepted his suggestion. Although something within me stirred with unease, I chose to trust his judgment, believing he was acting in my best interest. The interest he showed in my well-being was appealing, and I found myself drawn to his intellect and life experiences. Upon returning home, I found my husband surprised by my decision not to cancel the session. I explained that the pastor believed there were underlying issues I needed to address individually. While I was aware that my reasoning might not be entirely accurate, my husband seemed relieved that he wouldn't have to attend. Perhaps it stemmed from the fact that I had pushed for counseling in the first place, and he was merely seeking to accommodate my wishes. Interestingly, despite the pastor having been a fixture at the church since my attendance began, I had never observed him in a different light prior to our counseling sessions. The next session was scheduled for the following week, which raised my suspicions since our counseling typically occurred on a bi-weekly basis due to his demanding schedule. Even his personal assistant remarked casually that weekly sessions were uncommon, implying that I must be fortunate to secure such an opportunity. I took this as an indication that my situation warranted special attention, which left me unsure of how to process my feelings. Yet, I couldn't help but feel grateful that someone deemed my circumstances significant enough to warrant their time. On the Sunday just prior to my next individual counseling session, the pastor delivered a sermon that I no longer recall the specific topic of, but what I do remember vividly are the feelings I experienced during that moment. I felt an overwhelming sense of pride and admiration for him, a sentiment that may sound somewhat absurd. It was akin to the feeling of knowing a celebrity and experiencing the thrill of seeing them in their element. Witnessing him at the pulpit that day offered me a newfound appreciation for his presence and the work he was doing. Although he was in his mid-50s with gray hair and a height of approximately 5 feet 8 inches, which did not compare to that of my husband who stood at 6 feet 1 inch, he presented himself impeccably. His attire was always crisp and meticulously ironed, reflecting a keen attention to detail that set him apart. While I had listened to several of his sermons in the past, on that particular Sunday, he exuded a charisma that felt even more pronounced than I remembered. Though I wouldn't equate him to a rock star, there was indeed an aura about him that resonated with the audience. As I began to understand the reasons behind the high regard in which many held him, I realized that perhaps this was why his secretary had implied that I was fortunate to have an individual counseling session with him scheduled so soon. It filled me with a sense of luck to have such an opportunity again, despite my inability to articulate why I felt this way. Naively, I began to believe that he held a fatherly affection towards me, a feeling that I struggled to manage. My emotions felt uncontrollable, possibly due to the vulnerability I had only ever shown to my husband. I had shared some of my darkest trauma with him, a conversation I had been unable to initiate with my spouse. The day prior to my individual counseling session, a wave of anxiety swept over me, accompanied by an unsettling sense of apprehension. As I wrestled with my thoughts, an embarrassing notion crossed my mind: could it be that I harbored a secret crush on him? This realization was not only awkward but also fraught with uncertainty, as I was acutely aware that he might not reciprocate these feelings. The fear of misinterpreting our interactions loomed large, creating a cloud of self-doubt. Compounding this emotional turmoil was the fact that we were both married, which intensified my feelings of guilt and moral conflict. I knew I should put a stop to these burgeoning feelings before they spiraled out of control, yet a part of me longed to explore this unexpected attraction. In an attempt to rationalize my emotions, I convinced myself that this was simply a fleeting infatuation, something that would diminish as I grew to know him more deeply. The day of the counseling session arrived, which I distinctly remember was a Monday. As the time approached, my nerves escalated to the point where I contemplated canceling the appointment entirely. However, despite the wave of anxiety coursing through me, I managed to summon enough courage to attend, clinging to the hope that perhaps this session would shed some light on my feelings. Much like our previous encounter, this session unfolded as a casual conversation about our lives, yet this time we consciously avoided any discussion of my husband. I positioned myself across from him, creating an atmosphere that felt reminiscent of a therapy session, where one often explores complex emotions in a safe space. As the subsequent sessions unfolded, we began to grow increasingly comfortable in each other's presence, a subtle shift that marked the evolution of our interactions. When my husband inquired about the sessions, I reassured him that they were going well. In this period, I felt a renewed sense of positivity about my marriage, believing I had discovered an outlet for the frustrations I had been experiencing. My attitude towards my husband improved. I made a conscious effort to treat him with more kindness, refraining from the nagging he had often complained about. As a result, our arguments became less frequent, and for a moment, it felt as though I had uncovered another avenue to address the shortcomings in our relationship. The next counseling session was scheduled for late in the evening, around 8 p.m., following the evening service. The unusual timing struck me as odd, as it deviated from our standard counseling days, and I noticed the absence of the front office secretary. Despite these peculiarities, my growing comfort with the situation outweighed any concerns I had. I had begun to feel unwell, perhaps catching a cold, so I opted to wear a turtleneck sweater for warmth. Upon entering his office, he immediately noticed my chilled state and seized the opportunity to shift closer to me, inquiring about how I was feeling. I casually mentioned that it felt as though my temperature might be rising, and as he moved closer, I acutely sensed his proximity. In an unexpected moment, he gently placed the back of his hand against my neck to check my temperature. His touch sent a shiver down my spine, startling me into a moment of uncertainty. Sensing my reaction, he quickly withdrew his hand, casually commenting that my temperature seemed normal. However, convinced that I was indeed warming up, I took his hand and pressed it back against my neck, trying to persuade him of my condition. At this point, the atmosphere between us was charged with tension, as we sat in close quarters, surrounded by an unspoken understanding of the emotional undercurrents at play. Before I fully grasped what was happening, he leaned in with the intention to kiss me on the lips. In an instinctive reaction, I turned my face away, exposing the side of my neck instead. He began to kiss my neck, and then his lips ventured downward to my cleavage. I sat there in shock, completely frozen, allowing him to continue without protest. My mind raced as I remained motionless, caught in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. When he lifted his head, attempting to kiss me again, I resisted slightly, yet we seemed to dissolve into the moment, and he began to touch me, an experience that felt like it was suspended in time. As the seconds turned into what felt like an eternity, I wanted it to end, and in a moment of surrender, I allowed him to do as he pleased. He reached down, trying to use his fingers to escalate the intimacy, but I resisted, holding on to a small thread of control. He attempted to unbutton my clothing, but I was firm in my refusal, so we remained at the intersection of confusion and desire, exchanging kisses. Eventually, I began to pull away slowly as clarity returned and a rising tide of guilt washed over me. It felt as though things had progressed too quickly, and with my gaze cast downward, I pushed him away gently while insisting that we couldn't continue. Rising from the couch, I left his office without looking back, carrying an immense weight of guilt over what had transpired. As I made my way home that day, I felt as though I had committed a grave sin. The internal turmoil was compounded by a sense of shame. I blamed myself, believing that I had somehow tempted him, leading a man of God to falter in his moral judgment. In the days that followed, I spiraled into a deep sense of depression, which prompted me to avoid attending church for 2 weeks. My husband noticed my withdrawal, yet I chose to remain silent about the truth, fearing the potential repercussions and uncertain about how he would respond to what had happened. After 2 weeks, a gradual lifting of the depression began, and the heavy shroud of guilt slowly started to subside. I resumed my normal routine, feeling less burdened by shame as time passed. The phone number displayed on my screen was unexpected. It belonged to my pastor, a detail that took me by surprise, especially considering the events of the previous 3 weeks. Those weeks had been filled with tension and confusion, following his attempt to force himself on me. His call stirred mixed feelings within me, a blend of shock and a strange sense of inevitability. I had known him to be flawed, and perhaps I should have anticipated that he might reach out to apologize, yet the reality of the situation stung. He began our conversation with a sincere apology, acknowledging his actions as a sin and stressing that he was not exempt from error, much like anyone else. He used phrases like, "in the heat of the moment," as an attempt to explain his behavior, but he was clear that this did not excuse his actions. Throughout his apology, he implored me not to let this incident deter me from attending church, urging me to stay connected to our community despite what had transpired. His words washed over me, and I felt a rush of naivety mixed with discomfort. I kept repeating, "No, it's okay," as if I were the one needing to apologize for a crime I did not commit. During that awkward call, I felt an unsettling mixture of compulsion and resignation, as though I was on autopilot, agreeing with him to expedite our conversation and find a way to disengage from what felt like a heavy, uncomfortable exchange. As he continued to advocate for my return to church, he mentioned the possibility of canceling our individual counseling sessions to alleviate any concerns I harbored. Strangely, I found myself responding with a meek, "No, it's okay," detached from my true feelings. After the call ended, disbelief washed over me. I was astonished that I had agreed not only to return to church but also to attend another counseling session. Looking back, it might have been wiser to cut off contact entirely and block his number. Yet, I have always been the type to keep my promises and had cultivated a profound respect and admiration for him over the years. I feared the thought of offending or disappointing him, even as I recognized that agreeing to meet him again could lead me back into a perilous situation. Driven by a mixture of obligation and misplaced trust, I decided to follow through. When Sunday arrived, I took a seat at the back of the church, which was large enough to accommodate around 1,500 to 1,600 members. My hope was to blend into the crowd and go unnoticed, but that was not to be the case. As I prepared to leave the service, an usher approached me, conveying that the pastor wanted to see me. I made my way to his office, where I found several other church members waiting for their chance to speak with him. I sat quietly, patiently awaiting my turn while anxiety blossomed in my chest. Finally, when I was ushered into his presence, he greeted me with his familiar charm, appearing genuinely pleased to see me. As our conversation unfolded, I began to feel more at ease, almost as if the past had been erased from our shared history. We arranged for another meeting, and it became evident that this was not just a simple counseling session. It felt oddly intimate, almost akin to a date, particularly considering his busy schedule with so many people awaiting him outside his office. I felt a bizarre sense of special treatment, as if our connection held some significance beyond the pastoral. The counseling session took place that evening. Once again, I found myself entering into a situation that mirrored a recurring nightmare I had unwittingly walked into. The secretary was absent, and upon entering, he welcomed me with a hug, our cheeks brushing together, a gesture that felt both warm and unsettling. In a moment of vulnerability, I allowed him to kiss me, which quickly escalated into something more. The situation spiraled out of control as he gradually removed my clothes, and before I knew it, I found myself on his office sofa, clad only in my underwear. He coaxed me into discarding that final barrier, and we engaged in sexual activities right there, in the sanctuary of his office. Afterward, he made me promise to return for another meeting, and as I left, I was engulfed by guilt. The sensation of dirtiness washed over me, reminiscent of the secretive activities I had previously engaged in behind my husband's back. An internal struggle raged. I could have exposed him, potentially liberating myself from this turmoil, yet I felt as though I was a marionette, with him as the puppeteer, orchestrating my compliance. As time passed, I continued to meet him, both in his office and occasionally at nearby hotels, taking care to keep our encounters discreet. He managed every detail and arrangement, reveling in the sense of control he wielded over me. I simply acquiesced, unable to wrest myself free from the grip of this disturbing relationship. Ironically, amidst this chaos, I found myself feeling that my relationship with my husband was improving. With my emotional demands redirected, I was no longer seeking much from him, even as I navigated the murky waters of my own choices. The pastor noticed a shift in my behavior and seemed genuinely pleased, even though the true reasons for this change eluded him. I, however, was grappling with a growing sense of guilt. My conscience wrestled with the conflicting emotions I experienced in maintaining a relationship with my pastor while striving to remain a devoted believer in my faith. This internal struggle was complicated further by the fact that my spiritual leader seemed to be the very person encouraging me toward sin. He preached passionately against the very actions we engaged in together after church services, creating a dissonance that weighed heavily on my mind. This dissonance was particularly heartbreaking when I observed his wife and children, who were older than I, supporting him in his role as a pastor. Week after week, he stood before his devoted congregation, delivering sermons with apparent comfort and conviction. During this time, a part of me began to question his authenticity, viewing him as a fraud and a master manipulator, yet I found myself ensnared in the complexities of our affair. By this point, the affair had progressed for approximately 4 months. He introduced me to a variety of erotic experiences, many of which were unconventional and strikingly provocative. I was not accustomed to such explorations. My knowledge of intimate acts had been limited to the fundamental styles I had encountered in my past. Though my husband had once encouraged me to embrace new experiences in our intimate life, I had often been resistant, stemming from the trauma we had endured during our time of homelessness. Ironically, I found myself engaging in activities with the pastor that my husband had expressed interest in, yet I had previously rejected. This realization deepened my feelings of guilt, as I began to perceive my affair as not only an infidelity against my husband but also as a betrayal of the pastor. Through this affair, the stark contrast between my lackluster sexual relationship with my husband and the excitement I found with the pastor became glaringly obvious. Regrettably, I felt a sense of domination in my interactions with the pastor, even though I was fully aware that he was exploiting me for his own desires. The guilt of engaging in new experiences with someone I did not love and had no intention of building a future with weighed heavily on me, as I was neglecting the desires of my husband. This guilt haunted me relentlessly, compelling me to reconsider my reluctance to explore intimacy with my husband. I began to recognize that I had been selfish in our intimate moments, casting blame on him for the shadows of my past, including our earlier hardships. The intimacy between my husband and me had focused solely on my own pleasure, neglecting his needs. After enduring the trauma of my previous assault, I had erected emotional barriers that prevented me from fully participating in intimacy with him. However, the affair sparked an unexpected shift in my outlook. Aware of the weight of my guilt, I resolved to rekindle some sense of excitement in my marriage. I yearned to explore new dimensions of intimacy with my husband, even if it meant trying out some of the adventurous activities I had experienced with the pastor. In a bid to make amends and alleviate the guilt I carried, I planned a surprise for my husband one evening when he returned home from work. I prepared a bath for both of us, a gesture I had never made before, and initiated intimate moments that felt refreshing and novel for both of us. My husband appeared pleasantly surprised by my newfound adventurous spirit, prompting him to ask what had inspired this change. I offered a vague explanation about wanting to explore new things. He lightheartedly suggested that perhaps I had learned it from therapy, a comment that struck a nerve. The defensiveness that bubbled up within me ignited a disagreement between us. Although he quickly apologized, it was evident that he had registered my intense reaction to his offhand remark. This moment of tension served as a wake-up call for me, compelling me to confront the inherent risks associated with my affair with the pastor. I found myself increasingly consumed by worry, contemplating the devastating consequences that would unfold if my husband were to uncover the truth. Paranoia began to creep in, and I even found myself suspecting that he might be testing me, pretending to be oblivious to my internal turmoil. As the following morning dawned and my husband left for work, I remained unsettled by his earlier comment. The fear that my husband could be on to something gnawed at me, pushing me to panic and set off a series of events that would irrevocably alter my life. In a moment of desperation, I reached out to the pastor via text, sharing my fears about my husband's potential suspicions regarding our relationship. I provided him with intricate details about my emotional state, an impulsive move that I would soon come to regret. The pastor immediately called me, insistent that we meet in person to discuss this precarious situation, emphasizing that matters of such gravity were not suitable for text or phone conversations. Consequently, we arranged to meet at a restaurant located outside of town, setting the stage for a discussion that would further complicate my already tumultuous life. The pastor had a tendency to disguise his true self, which instilled a sense of apprehension in me as I prepared for our upcoming meeting. I harbored a strong desire to bring our affair to an end, yet I found myself gripped by fear regarding how he would react to my decision. Over time, he had increasingly exhibited controlling behavior, making me wary of any confrontation. As a precaution, I took the step of downloading an application on my phone designed to record conversations, hoping that it would provide some measure of security during our discussion. When I arrived at our designated meeting spot, I noticed that he had gotten there early and was casually sipping a cup of coffee. I ensured that the recording app was active and ready to capture our dialogue. The first question that he posed to me was about how my husband had discovered our affair. I hesitated but eventually conveyed to him that I was uncertain whether my husband genuinely knew or if he was merely toying with my mind to elicit a reaction. As our conversation progressed, I made it clear that I felt it was essential for us to stop seeing each other, as anxiety about being caught was weighing heavily on my mind. In response to my concerns, he asked if my desire to end things was truly the only issue at hand. I affirmed my position, emphasizing the urgency of the situation. Rather than respecting my feelings, he advised me to refrain from making hasty judgments or panicking. He suggested that I should limit our communication to avoid detection and even proposed purchasing a burner phone specifically for us to use in our conversations. I expressed my frustration at his suggestions, feeling that he was not grasping the depth of my concerns. I reiterated that my wish to terminate our relationship stemmed from a profound fear of my husband discovering the truth. When I asked why he didn't seem to share my level of concern, especially given that he had far more to lose, he claimed to understand my situation but insisted that he loved me deeply. This sentiment struck me as deeply irrational, as my feelings for him could not have been more different. To me, he represented a mistake and a predator who had exploited my vulnerabilities. Reflecting on our relationship, I recognized that he had originally been an escape from the monotony of my everyday life and that I had viewed him as someone with a superior understanding of the world. However, it became alarmingly clear that we were reaching divergent conclusions regarding our future. While he wanted to take a cautious approach to prevent our affair from being discovered, I had made the definitive decision to put an end to it. The following day, a FedEx driver arrived at my door with a package that required a signature. To my astonishment, it was the burner phone that the pastor had sent me. I found his action both absurd and fraught with risk, suspecting he was using the phone as another means of manipulation and control over me. Initially, I thought about discarding the phone altogether but hesitated at the last moment, uncertain of what to do with it. When our usual meeting day rolled around, I chose not to show up. He called me, and I answered, ready to confront the situation. He inquired about my absence and questioned why I hadn't utilized the burner phone. I firmly stated that I no longer wished to continue our relationship. His response was to pressure me, insisting that we needed to discuss this matter in person. I conveyed to him that his neediness felt unattractive and that the risks we were taking made a compelling case for ending our relationship. After that phone call, silence fell between us for a considerable period. During that time, I focused my efforts on rekindling my relationship with my husband. For a while, it appeared that things were improving, we ceased our constant quarrels, and I deliberately worked on enhancing how I treated him, particularly in the context of our intimacy. I encouraged him to take the lead without seeking my permission, which required some adjustment on his part. He even took the initiative to reduce his work hours to spend more time with me and our children. This positive phase in our relationship, however, felt somewhat unnatural, as if it required effort to maintain. Several months passed since my last encounter with the pastor, and I had stopped attending that church entirely, approximately 2 to 3 months. At that point, I began searching for a new church for myself and our children. Our former church community inquired about our sudden absence, and I explained that we were planning to relocate. Even my husband found my abrupt withdrawal from church attendance and therapy peculiar. Eventually, we discovered a new church and began attending regularly. The change brought a sense of stability, and my children seemed content with this new environment. My husband, who had never been particularly fond of church, joined us occasionally, preferring to spend his Sundays watching football. As time progressed, our intimacy began to revert to its previous state. I found myself regressing, gaining weight, sinking into a deepening depression, and experiencing the growing pangs of loneliness that crept into my life. To address these feelings, I made the decision to seek help from a licensed therapist, opting for a female therapist this time. Initially, I intended for it to be couples therapy and invited my husband to accompany me, but he declined. I attended only 4 sessions before concluding that it was not the right avenue for me. One fateful Sunday, I made the mistake of returning to my former church. Reflecting on my motivations for going back, I realized I was uncertain. Perhaps I had a deep-seated desire to reconnect with my fellow church members, to find solace and familiar faces in the very place I had chosen to leave behind. The moment I stepped back into the church after months of absence, a wave of nostalgia washed over me. I longed for the life I had just a few months earlier, a period that felt like a distant memory now. The sense of comfort I once experienced was replaced by an uncomfortable awareness of my own misery, especially after the church service had concluded. As I stood there, some members of the congregation who recognized me approached, eager to chat and catch up on lost time. Among the familiar faces, the pastor also spotted me amid the bustling scene. At first, his curiosity about my unexpected return was evident. He requested that I join him in his office for a private conversation, a proposition I accepted, even though there were others waiting to speak with him. To my surprise, I was ushered into his office ahead of the others, a gesture that felt somewhat special in the moment. He initiated our conversation by inquiring about my well-being. Remarkably, he did not press me about my absence or the reasons behind my return. Instead, he seemed to genuinely care about my situation, making assumptions that I had come to seek his guidance. During our exchange, he offered the opportunity to meet again, and though my words were sparse, I agreed to another session. Thus began our renewed meetings, albeit at a reduced frequency of once a week. We intentionally chose different venues for our encounters, sometimes opting for hotels or even parking lots, consciously avoiding the church office. I made a deliberate choice to distance myself from the church, while still honoring my commitment to my new home church. Approximately 2 months into this renewed phase of our relationship, the pastor unexpectedly canceled our meeting. He expressed that things were not going well for him and assured me that we would talk later. His tone was peculiar, but I dismissed it as unimportant. The next day, my husband came home from work, newspaper in hand, bearing news that would shatter my world. The headline of the local paper was jarring, detailing a scandal involving the pastor. Multiple women from his congregation had bravely come forward to reveal their experiences of ongoing affairs with him. The article suggested that there were additional women who had not yet stepped into the light. Discovering that I was just one of many women involved was a devastating blow to my self-esteem. My heart sank as reality set in. I was not alone in this betrayal. Some women recounted affairs that spanned years, while others indicated their involvement was more recent. The report even mentioned the prospect of a lawsuit against him, all occurring during a time when the #MeToo movement was gaining traction. My husband confronted me about the unfolding situation, his gaze intense and suspicious. He surmised that I might also be entangled with the pastor, considering my therapy sessions and the uncanny similarities between my story and those of the other women who had come forward. It didn't take long for him to connect the dots, and soon he demanded a confession from me. Initially, I denied any involvement, clinging to the belief that he had no solid proof. But I was gravely mistaken. Somehow, he managed to recover the text messages I had thought were deleted, leaving little room for denial. The evidence was irrefutable, and the gravity of the situation pressed down on me. Eventually, I admitted to the affair, but I attempted to spin the narrative to suggest that I was a victim of coercion. I claimed that he had forced himself on me, but justifying my actions proved exceedingly difficult. My husband pointed out the frequency of our communications and the damning evidence of the recovered messages. He argued that I had a responsibility to inform him about the affair, and regardless of the circumstances, I was still guilty of betrayal. In my desperation, I attempted to explain the assault I had endured during our period of homelessness, hoping he would understand the truth of what had transpired. However, his skepticism was palpable. It seemed like he was unwilling to hear me. The emotional weight of our conversation was suffocating, as I realized that my husband's affection had somehow vanished. His response to my pleas for forgiveness was chilling. He stated that our relationship had been over for some time. He astutely connected the duration of my affair to the deterioration of our marriage, amplifying my feelings of shame and devastation. I knew that the consequences of my actions were dire not only for me but also for my children. As my husband left that day, he was gone for 2 full days, a period filled with uncertainty and despair. When he returned, he finally broke the news that we would be separating, instructing me to seek legal counsel. At that time, my husband was the primary earner in our household, while I was unemployed. The separation agreement included stipulations that granted me primary custody of our children, along with some financial support, allowing me to retain the family home for their well-being. Despite these provisions, my heart was heavy with regret and an overwhelming sense of guilt. I yearned for my husband to grasp the truth, that I had been manipulated by a predator. Engaging in an affair was never my intention, and the fallout from this situation weighed heavily on my conscience. The most painful aspect of this entire experience is the realization that this pastor, a figure who was supposed to guide and uplift the community, acted in the most despicable manner imaginable. He exploited the vulnerability of multiple women who turned to him for guidance and support during difficult times in their lives. Rather than providing the pastoral care that was expected of him, he chose to use these women to fulfill his own selfish desires and needs. I now understand that I was not alone in this. He manipulated me in the same way he did with others, and it is impossible to truly know how many women he took advantage of, both within the church setting and beyond its walls. I would like to see myself as a victim in this situation, as I was subjected to his manipulation, which ultimately led to devastating consequences in my personal life. This manipulation contributed to the dissolution of my relationship with the love of my life, as well as the tearing apart of my family unit. The anger I feel intensified when I learned that the pastor faced minimal repercussions for his actions. The case that was brought against him by those women was dismissed in court, based on the misguided belief that it was consensual. This dismissal only added to the injustice of the situation. To make matters even more disheartening, the pastor openly admitted to having engaged in multiple affairs and confessed his sins publicly before the congregation. Instead of facing the accountability he deserved, the church leadership took the inadequate step of placing him and his wife on a paid leave of 120 days, all while mandating that they attend marriage counseling twice a week. This arrangement meant that, after a brief suspension, he would eventually return to his position as the lead pastor, continuing to wield influence over the church community. Meanwhile, the young women involved in these affairs remained largely unacknowledged. Their identities weren't made public, yet most church members were aware of who they were. Disturbingly, these women were not offered counseling support and chose to leave the church permanently, seemingly unfairly bearing the brunt of blame for the situation. Since I no longer participate in church activities, I have lost touch with the community and the extent of the church's awareness regarding the pastor's predatory behavior toward me. However, I did speak with a friend who still attends, and she provided me with insight into the ongoing situation. It is my firm belief that this pastor deserves a far harsher reckoning for the harm he has inflicted, particularly upon me. Most significantly, the fallout from this experience has had a profound impact on my faith. Currently, I am separated from my husband, and a divorce is pending, causing me to navigate an emotional landscape filled with uncertainty. Despite everything, I still hold on to a glimmer of hope that my husband may reconsider and that we can find our way back to each other, as we have successfully overcome even greater challenges together in the past. The journey has been painful, but I continue to cling to the hope of reconciliation amidst the turmoil that has resulted from this pastor's actions.